So welcome to our Writers' Chat session for July 21st. I'd like to officially welcome Dr. Sandra Monteiro. Sandra is a faculty member and in the Faculty of Health Sciences. She is a merit scientist and appointed to the Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence and Impact, Anesthesiology and Radiology. As well, she has a secondary appointment to the Center for Simulation-Based Learning as the Assistant Director for Simulation Scholarship. In addition to all of this, Dr. Monteiro is also seconded to the Touchstone Institute as the Director of Research and Analysis, where she oversees the psychometric analyses of high-stakes competency-based assessments for internationally educated health professionals seeking entry to practice in Canada. And so with her Touchstone team, she develops research initiatives to understand best practices for assessment and standard setting. And so we're extremely delighted to have you today, Sandra. And our topic today is really expressing yourself, finding the right place for your work. And so we wanted to get your thoughts and insights on how do we best express ourselves and find that match for the stories that we want to share.
Presented that way in terms of expressing yourself puts a very different tone on it. And so my starting point was in terms of thinking where you might want to send your paper. I feel like there's two ways you can end up with a paper and 2 points at which you might be considering what journal to send it to. And that's the point when you're going to decide how and where you want to express yourself. So when you just have the idea for a project or a review paper that you're thinking of writing is one point. And another time that I find these discussions come up is someone like a student, a more junior person, perhaps they've just finished a thesis or some kind of education requirement, and they want to publish that piece. And you're having kind of a different conversation because the writing is mostly done and you want to know who's going to appreciate it. So if we start with when you first have the idea, it really is about making a statement. It is all about expressing your ideas, your therefore statement, your message to your field, your message to an international audience, so the world in some sense. And it's an important time to reflect on what journal is going to best convey that message for you. For some people, it might be driven by career goals. So, you might as well aim for the top journal in your field. And that might just be good advice to begin with, because you never know. And once you make that decision, then you kind of craft your story around what that journal normally expects, right? So then that means you take some time to read around the journal, maybe look at the editor's notes or editorials, coming out of that journal and get a sense of that culture and what kinds of expressions they value.
I don't know if you have any thoughts that come to mind or any insights from your own experience of, kind of that focus first.
Yeah, definitely. So I think a lot of people that I collaborate with are very brave and they'll pick the top journal for the field that I'm in terms of health professions education, and I focus on a lot of clinical reasoning work. JAMA is a top journal. BMJ might be up there, academic medicine. And so that might just be our goal to begin with, because we want to hit clinical educators that are already scholars at some point, and we have a message that's targeted at that level of audience. And on an international stage. So we'll just sort of do that, I think, as part of our process and craft our story from the beginning, whether it's a review paper or an empirical study. And often I'll encourage more junior people to think in that way too. You never know, they might send it out for review, and the better journals tend to have better reviewers. So even if you're rejected after a review, you get some really great feedback. And then you can rethink. And sometimes the reviewers will suggest journals, if they think that this story is not fit for their audience, or they, maybe it's too technical or something like that. They will come back with some suggestions for journals as well. So Yeah, I think identify the top journals in your field, have that short list ready. It's always worth having the courage to start there. And I think the other thing is look through your references. Who are you citing? And which journals have they published in? Because that's a good sign for where the conversations are happening already that are similar to the message you want to put out there.
And I think you raised some really good points there. Just touching on the latter one for a moment, because you're expressing yourself, but you're also finding that right fit. Yeah. And so knowing where the scholarly conversation is happening around your story and the ideas you want to express and making sure that's a match, I think that's a really good approach to look at. And the other point that you brought out about, aiming for, those top journals in your field. And even if there's a rejection, the feedback that you get from that helps the growth of your own story and how you can then share that and craft it further. Any other thoughts around that part before we move to, I want to touch on also your second.
Yeah, I think maybe a better way to, and maybe something useful if you're kind of more of a visual imaginer, maybe a better analogy for thinking of how to make that decision is if you wanted to sort of express yourself with a statement and you wanted to walk into an international conference and kind of get up on stage and say something, who would you think that audience would be? And, if there were two conferences side by side and you could go into door A or door B in a sense, where would that statement be most well received or where would it have the most impact, right? And I think sometimes it's about what your therefore statement is trying to convey. Do you want to change something in that field or are you just adding something to what's already known? And I think in having a loftier goal of trying to change the way the field is thinking about a problem usually would raise, I think for me, the level of journal that I'd aim for, the impact factor, the international audience for it. So yeah, I think if you can imagine the people that you're speaking to in that kind of physical sense, you might start to visualize the kinds of journals that are best targeted for your story.
That's a great way to think about it too, is, and this ties in with some conversations we've had in a couple of the earlier chats about who is your target audience, very much ties into that fit and, and not only do you want to, I think express your thoughts, but express them in a way that they are going to land with your target audience. And your other, you were sharing sort of the one scenario of, the approach where you want to express yourself and share that idea with the audience. Now, you touched on a different scenario where you may have work that's been done. Perhaps it's been by some graduate students or other students you work with or other colleagues, and they want to now find a space for it where they didn't kind of think about it, at the outset. And so can you share some thoughts around that experience?
I would say that is the more challenging one because it's about mentoring that author to try to think about that from the beginning. So, publication may not have been their goal if they were writing a thesis for a master's defense, for example. So their audience would be very small, right? They're writing for their defense committee or they're writing for their instructor in a course. So that requires kind of a similar conversation and maybe, helping the author understand that there's going to be some rewriting that's required. And I think it depends on the career stage for that author as well. If it is a student or a more junior researcher. And I think, again, going with a high impact journal still kind of makes sense. If you're junior, you want to try to get, articles that have that recognition on your CV more quickly. But that is also a bigger leap to make from starting with a finished written piece. So I feel like I end up kind of counseling that group of authors towards maybe a mid-level journal or something a bit more accessible. They're newer to publication. It's an easier transition into that process. They're going to get more coaching through the writing process, I think, with some of the I'll say maybe lower impact journals. The audience for that tends to be less critical, perhaps, and really looking for scholarship that they can use on a day-to-day basis. So those kinds of journals tend to be more appropriate for the situation. When it's a student that says, I think this has a great message and I'd like to publish it, that ends up being the shorter route, I think, and easier for them. And then sometimes if they're very motivated, then we might start that conversation from scratch to, think of their next paper, and then we'll kind of do it in a different way.
Yeah, one of the things I found with some learners that I've worked with who then want to look at for publication is, and you touched on this a little bit, of the scope in which they were writing that initial work might have been for a small group. So it might have been for their professor, it might have been for a master's or PhD thesis. And so it may not take the broader context or the broader environment into account in the paper, and the paper might be very focused on their specific aspect. And so I think that that's what I found sometimes having to coach learners, is that the broadening out, how does your work really fit in that broader context? Mm-hmm. Are there other things that you have found that you've needed to do coaching around that perhaps are tips we could share with others who might be in a similar situation?
Specifically coaching an author to think in that broader context?
Yeah, or that we can then apply to our own work as well, either coaching or that we can reflect on.
I think it helps to take some time, read around the topic, but also maybe take opportunities to present their work. So I find if they, I'll try to get them invited to a discussion group where they present their ideas, almost like a lab presentation or something like that. They start to discuss their thoughts and proposals with people that they haven't met before, and it might spark a new way of thinking. Or there might be someone in the room that knows of a great paper that can just pivot it in the right direction. So I think finding groups of people to talk to at your local institution that might be experts in that field, or maybe not, sometimes just other people from an interdisciplinary audience can have some great ideas for where to take the story. So asking them to present at a local conference or a lab setting or discussion group, I think really gets them out of that kind of box that they've been in where they were a student particularly. And like you said, just sort of focused on what their supervisor wanted. So they have to explain their ideas in different ways to different people. And I think that really does well to support the writing process too.
And I think that's important, that piece of talking out your ideas and talking it out with different groups of people, and just kind of testing out the idea. Does it make sense? Are you explaining it well? And if you're having trouble explaining it, then that gives some insight into, okay, I need to kind of work on what the story is and how I'm going to express that story.
Absolutely. And sometimes the best way, you may have your therefore statement in mind based entirely on your reading and your experience, but by virtue of talking through those challenges with people and how you want to convey your message, maybe what you decide is you have to do an empirical study first, right? And so sometimes that kind of wonderful stuff happens and you start getting more creative, and then you've got some data studies planned, and then maybe also a review paper that's come out of it. Yeah, so that's also the fun part of it. And then from there you kind of think, okay, where's this empirical study going to go? Where's the review paper going to go for those journals? And that's always the joy, the surprise of where it can end up.
Yeah, and it's nice too to think about, the story not just necessarily having a definite ending, right? We think about many papers of where are we going to go next? And so, I like that you brought up that there might be, an empirical study, but there might be a review paper. Maybe there's an editorial piece that's associated with it. And so, the story and you expressing yourself in that area really is, the conversation. And the conversation just doesn't end necessarily with one article.
Yeah, I imagine you've talked about this in some of the other meetings in terms of rejection rates and just sort of understanding that there's going to be some amount of rejection, and even being invited to significantly revise your paper is a win. And even those opportunities can be rare, depending on the journal. So always worth trying again, because if you've got a message to share and you've got a group of co-authors that feel it's valuable, then it's worth trying at least one more time.
Yeah, no, that's great. And we do have dealing with rejection coming up later in our series. And so I know that's something, probably on many minds, is, kind of how do we deal with that? But trying to take some of the positive, like you mentioned, out of it, the reviewer comments, or that they might even suggest another place where your story may fit better.
Yes.
Sandra, is there any other tips or kind of words of wisdom you could leave us with today?
Specifically around expressing yourself?
Or just in general about, the writing process?
Well, I think just going back to this idea of, how I might coach a student and get them to present at conferences. I think remembering that those are opportunities to express yourself as well, and get your message out there. So if your paper is rejected, or if it's taking a long time in review, there's no need to be stalled, right? You can still share your data at international, local conferences, in a course that you teach. Just talk with experts in the field and share your results with them informally. I mean, they're still valid. Talk to people about what the next steps might be, even if you haven't gotten that final acceptance for your study in the journal. If maybe it's not your first choice, maybe it's your third choice, but you can do a lot to spread your message through your field.
Yeah, and I think that raises another thought for me too, is that just by having those conversations, whether they're informal, whether they're within your course, you end up starting to connect with others who have, similar interests that you may not have known. And so, sort of the more you put yourself out there with your thoughts and ideas, the more connections you may have, and it may lead to further collaborations with others that you may not have known were possible without sharing your story. So kind of keeping it to yourself and not expressing yourself kind of closes that door a little bit.
And sorry, there was one little tip. I don't know if this audience, it feels like a secret, but most editors or associate editors are open to email communications or inquiries about the appropriateness of your article for their journal. And so, don't be shy to take that route. I mean, I guess the worst that can happen is they don't respond to your email, but I've had some good success with just reaching out to a journal saying, I've got this paper, it's slightly over your word count. I think this message is important. Would you consider it? And yeah, very positive experiences with reaching out in that way.
And I know that I have personally received some of that feedback too, is that we have one article in review right now. We have a second kind of in the wings. And it was recommended to me to reach out to, if we get accepted for the first one, to reach out before submitting the second, that this to the editor, that it's a follow-up article.
Oh yeah, that's exactly.
And see where the interest is to, continue the same story, just further advancing it.
Yeah, that's another good reason to check in first. It's not breaking the rules. It's not giving you an advantage. It's saving them time, because they don't have to go find reviewers, or they may not have to read the full paper because you've kind of set it up for them a little bit at first. So yeah, try to take those routes when needed.